Hi, everybody. We are back today to talk about risk and risk management. Hello, everybody. We are here today with Carl Pritchard. Carl is a man who doesn't really need much of an introduction within the project management community. He's known as the risk guy. He's written over 7 books, and he's well known. He speaks. He's the teacher. He's a cornucopia of knowledge, and we're very happy to have him here today. Carl, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thank you. And I like that cornucopia of knowledge. I'll take that.
Carl, we're going to dive right into this. So we've talked a lot over the years, and you've recently sent me some emails, and we've been talking about the subject of risk. I'm very interested in risk these days in particular, because I feel that we are, with all of the different changes in technology that we're seeing, we're moving into what I like to call a world of total interconnectedness. And as we move into that world of total interconnectedness, risk is going to become more of an issue, and risk management is going to become more of an issue. So I think it's important that kind of people understand that and understand the dangers of this new world that we're kind of entering into. That being said, you've used a lot of terms and a lot of concepts that I'm not entirely familiar with. And so I'm wondering if you could just kind of help explain what these mean to you and why they're important. For instance, let's just get started. You talk about something called common risk, and you compare it to uncommon risk. Can you help us understand what the difference is and why this is so important?
Well, most of us actually try, when we talk about risk, focus on the uncommon. They're looking for what Nassim Taleb calls in his book, the black swan. We're looking for that one-off event that it's like, oh, giant flash of light and destruction kind of risk. And that is not the risk we need to worry about most of the time. Most of us, thank heavens, are not going to be struck by lightning. Yeah, it's not going to happen. We're in pretty good fettle on that score. We're not going to be hit by lightning. We're not going to be tripped up by some giant disaster in the skies. Instead, it's the little day-to-day stuff. It's the day-to-day risks that tend to bury us. More people die from things like a heart attack or a car accident than those who are struck by lightning, or one that's been hot of late, eaten by sharks. Yeah, that kind of stuff is so one-off. That's an uncommon risk. And yet, when we talk risk management, let's focus on the sharks. And the reason people want to do that is because, well, frankly, it's, for lack of a better word, it's sexy. It's something that people look at and go, wow, you actually can predict when people are going to be bitten by a shark? No. Yeah, you really can't pull that off. So that's the big distinction. The common stuff is the day-to-day, banal, boring stuff that we look at and say, oh yeah, well, I knew that could happen. Well, if you knew that could happen, why didn't you do something about it? Oh, because it's like a risk. No, those are the things that increase our costs, that suck up our clock, that actually foul up the rest of our projects, that make our lives miserable. It's the little crap that actually just gnaws away at us and takes it all away.
Well, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, I should know more about this, but, and I hate to sort of seem like the dummy, but that's fair game for me. It's fair to say that there's a difference between common risks that have a very large potential impact and common risks that have a very low potential impact, as well as uncommon risks that have a large potential impact and uncommon risks that have a very low impact. And it would seem to me that perhaps there's a way for people to, because you don't want to necessarily be focusing on all the day-to-day common risks if they have a low impact, if it's at the expense of high impact risks. So presumably there's some type of matrix that you can create that maps out, because what you really want to be focusing on, I'm guessing, I'm just speculating here, you really want to be focusing on primarily, or at least first, is common risks that have a high impact, as opposed to, so I mean, is that standard best practices within the business to establish those types of matrices?
Yeah, and basically it's a function of most risk organizations or risk-oriented organizations focus on probability and impact. And the ones they worry about, as you point out, are the high highs, high probability, high impact. And high probability is normally indicative of the fact that it's relatively common. It's something we have seen happen before. We're going to see it happen again. I grew up in Tornado Alley, and most people look at tornadoes as being, oh no, that's uncommon. Well, unless you happen to live in Tornado Alley, you come to kind of expect these things. And so the probability is moderate, let's say. The impact is high. The impact's crazy high. And so as a result, those are the kinds of things we address. The interesting thing, though, is those high probability, moderate impact risks, they're the ones that just chew an organization to pieces. And the reason they do is because even though they're only moderate impact, they're not a high impact. It's not, and then you die kind of thing. It's more a function of, well, it's going to cost you a little extra, or it's going to annoy the client kind of risks. You do enough of those, and sooner or later, your clients are going, goodbye. They're tired of you. They have grown fatigued of you not fixing what they see as a problem. It's you have problems in your house. Look around your house. You have a to-do list. And someplace on that to-do list, there's something that's been annoying you. For me, back in our last house, it was a little splinter on the floor. It's a little splinter on the floor. We had beautiful honey oak floors, and I would always run around in my socks, and I would catch myself. My wife was like, how come all of your socks have holes in them? And I forever catching myself on that splinter. Well, then fix the splinter. And I was like, yeah, I will get around to that. I promise I'll get around to that. Now that's low impact, high probability. Mm-hmm. Low impact, high probability. But then came the day when I came flying out of the kitchen, spun around toward the living room, and I didn't just catch my sock. I had my foot go right on top of the splinter, and it went between my toes and halfway down my foot. I had a piece of wood about that long in my foot. And I, of course, am screaming bloody murder. I get to the hospital, they remove it, but it took doctors and scalpels and things to get this piece of wood out of my foot. Now, little annoyance. Minor risk, low impact. What was the probability that it was actually going to make it halfway through my foot? Well, the probability there was low, but the impact was much, much higher. So this is why you do have to evaluate these things. And we get the warning signs in those repeated over and over and over again, those little nuisances that we tend to overlook and go, we'll fix that tomorrow kind of thing. And no go. That is not the plan. A well-run risk plan will actually incorporate the sense that, oh yeah, we're going to worry about the little stuff that is high frequency, that happens often, that goes on over and over and over again.
But it doesn't really sound like is it fair to say, it doesn't sound like there's a very scientific method for calculating these probabilities. It's based, not to say that it's totally unscientific, it is evidence-based in the sense that people have experienced these problems, and so it's based on the probabilities based on their prior experience. I mean, that's fair to say. It's just experience-based as opposed to something that they calculate mathematically.
Well, yes, but it needs to be experience-based consistently. And this is where a lot of organizations screw up. They will, instead of simply saying, they'll say, oh, it's high, medium, or low. And they'll say, Michael, go ahead, tell us, is that high, medium, or low? And he'll go, medium. Now, your idea of medium and my idea of medium are not going to be the same thing, which is why we need definitions of terms. For probability, for example, one of my big clients over in Sweden, actually, I love their term for high probability. Their term for high probability was virtual certainty. I love that. Virtual certainty, which means it's almost a lock that it's going to happen. By contrast, a manufacturer in Michigan, their term for high probability is more likely than not. More likely than not. Now, that's a great term. More likely than not. Because if somebody says, oh, that's a very high probability, you get to push back on them and say, really? That happens on more than half the time we're doing this? That happens? Well, not half. Okay, well, if it's not half, then it's not high. Oh, well, okay. But they have terms. They're preordained, and they can push back against those terms. And sadly, a lot of organizations never develop a risk dictionary to actually come up with this stuff, which, by the way, if you're watching this, well, obviously you're watching this, but heads up, if you're the first one to come up with the risk dictionary, you win. Yeah, you do. You win. It's game, set, match, you. And the reason you win is because you're the one who defines the terms. Oh, more likely than not was their high probability. Their version of low probability was seen it happen here once. I love that too.
Well,
Low probability.
That brings up another issue, another question that I have, which is that, seen it happen. I mean, it's all based on seeing it happen. Just, it seems like it's all based on seeing it happen just in various degrees, either seen it happen here once or seen it happen here a lot, or, virtually certain that this will happen based on prior experience. However, that being said, and this gets to the crux of this interview and why I asked you to join us today. We're dealing in, like I said, this world of total interconnectedness, which is being fueled by a lot of new technologies. So whether it's people moving into the Internet of Things, or people moving into automation or artificial intelligence, or a combination of all of these things and more, there's many more technologies that are changing the world right now. You have no baseline. There is no, and we have the same problem with estimation, which is that when, you can estimate projects successfully if you collect the data from similar projects in the past. But if you're working on projects with new technology in new environments, you don't really have any kind of baseline for estimating because it's all kind of new. And so I'm guessing that we're going to have the same problem with calculating risk probabilities, which is that you're dealing with entirely new technologies that you've never experienced before. So you can't say, I've seen it here happen once, or I've seen it here happen 10 times. So how do you, and that's the world we're moving into. So that being said, how do we deal with these types of risks going forward?
Well, and for that, particularly because you brought up the whole interconnectedness thing, interconnectedness is kind of intriguing in that when the more connections you have, every time you add or plug in one more connection, it increases the probability something's going to go wrong. I was talking to one of my peers over in London, Dr. David Hilson. He's known as the risk doctor. I'm the risk guy. He's the risk doctor. So, but I'm talking to Hilson, and he said, and I said to him, I said, Dave, I said, you're using the term known unknowns. And I said, that's a new one. I've known about known knowns, the risks we've run into before and we may run into again. Then we've got the unknown unknowns, which are the out of the blue 9/11 or COVID kind of risks. And then you've got unknown knowns, which is the new one that he dropped on us about 5 years ago. And I said, I'm still working on understanding what's an unknown known. And he said, did you ever have a child? I said, yeah, I got 2 sons. And he said, well, I want you to think about the first time you held them. First time you held them, you were looking in those eyes. And you're looking down at that little baby. And you know what went through your head. Those of you who are parents, you've had this experience. You're looking down into those little eyes and you're going, crap. There is so much that can go wrong in the next 20 years. Oh man, this is a disaster waiting to happen. And those of us who are parents, we've all been through that. We don't know what's going to go wrong. We don't know if the authorities are going to be involved or if it's hospitals or whatever, but we know something's going to go wrong. And when it comes to interconnectedness, the more connections that we create, the more of that interconnectedness there is, the greater the probability that one of those things, don't know which one, but one of those things is going to ultimately happen to us. And that goes to dealing with the whole difference with uncommon risk versus common risk. In this particular instance, it doesn't matter. You know, if you saw the movie or if you've read about Titanic, my wife and her family are actually all Titanic nuts. And the reason being is my wife's grandmother came over from Scotland, and she was supposed to, she had a ticket for the Titanic. And unfortunately, she missed the boat. Well, fortunately, she missed the boat. And family lore has it that she missed the boat. And as a result, the entire Adams family, that's my wife's maiden name, they came to be. And what was intriguing about that is if you read up on Titanic, you find out it wasn't just the iceberg. It was a whole bunch of a confluence of a whole bunch of different events that all came together to create this one gigantic disaster. Now, the sinking of the Titanic was obviously an uncommon risk. God himself could not sink that ship. But when it comes to that, think about that. When it comes to the Titanic, what caused it to sink? Well, it hit the iceberg. Why did it hit the iceberg? Because the guy didn't scream, "Iceberg, dead ahead," soon enough. He didn't shout that out early enough. Why not? Because he didn't have a pair of binoculars. Why not? Because the binoculars were locked in a mahogany cabinet 3 decks down. Why were they locked away? Because they didn't have a key. Why didn't they have a key? Because they changed the staff on the Titanic at the last minute. Look at all these different things that had to line up in order for the Titanic to go down. There was a guy who got bounced off the Titanic by a crew member from the Olympic, which went into dry dock, and he had the keys to the binocular cabinet. And I want you to think, your third mate on the Titanic, maiden voyage. I need those binoculars. Sorry, they're locked away in a mahogany cabinet. Well, get them out. We don't have the keys. Oh, well, break the cabinet open. It's mahogany. Are you out of your mind? This is our maiden voyage. We don't need binoculars. God himself could not sink this ship. Bad day. It took a whole bunch of different little tiny risk events coming to pass, converting to issues for that to ever actually sink the Titanic. And it took a great deal of interconnectedness for that to happen.
Well, I think that was well said in terms of being an appropriate analogy, especially explaining how risks can cascade upon each other. And that's actually generally what happens, whether it's with an airplane crash or any big catastrophe. You usually see that there's never one cause to a problem. There's usually multiple causes that kind of compound upon each other and create unusual circumstances. But that's still, I hate to put you on the spot, that I don't really feel like that answers the question, which is that if you are put into an environment or a project where you're using new technologies that have never been used before, you don't have any experiential evidence to turn to when trying to calculate where the risks reside and what the probability is, or even maybe the impact of those risks are. And is there a rule of thumb for dealing with this, for managing risk in this environment? Is there a new technology, a way of dealing with new technology where there is no data from the past or experience from the past?
Well, if you're, and that's perfectly sound, because if you are dealing with, say, a modification to an existing system, your risk is going to be much, much lower than if it's a wholly new system. But every time you say, okay, we're going to use a new system. Well, how many features do you want in this system? That's a big deal. How many features do you want? Well, I want it to do this and this. That's it. If you're dealing with an agile project and you've only got 2 user stories to serve, things are going to be pretty simple. By contrast, if you're dealing with an agile project and you've got 15, 20, 30 user stories to serve, and it's interesting, this is my little agile example behind me on the wall with all the Post-it notes. And those represent, each one of those represents a risk. Each one of those also represents a user story. And those user stories are elements that somebody wants in order to make this a good system. The more post-its that are up there, the more challenging and the riskier it becomes. Now, as far as rules of thumb go, you could probably say, okay, anytime a sprint has more than, half a dozen user stories, you can start calculating that it's going to have a higher probability that there's going to be a risk event occur during the course of that sprint. You can readily make that argument. It's pretty easy to say that, but it goes to organizational experience. If you've got a bunch of veteran Agile team members who know exactly what they're doing, if you've got Einstein, and Einstein, and you're like, yeah, we can handle half a dozen, we can handle a dozen, get out of our way. Well, nice to be you. But we need to make sure that we know, okay, who are we dealing with? How skilled are the people we're dealing with? Because all this, I don't care how many metrics you come up with and how many numbers you punch in here. What it comes down to is the people. And the people drive the degree of risk.
That's a useful heuristic. I think the example you gave about the user stories, that's exactly the kind of thing I was looking for. So thank you for providing that, for explaining that. I want to skip to some other references that you've made recently in some of your emails to me. You talk about the importance of a book called The Checklist Manifesto, which was written by a gentleman by the name of Atul Gawande. Could you explain why this book is relevant to you and why you feel it's important?
Gawande was actually involved in the medical community and found out people were dying when they were checking into hospitals. And a lot of us heard about these horror stories during the course of COVID, of course, but prior to that even, plenty of horror stories out there about people who have, they left a sponge inside of them or they left a pair of clamps inside of somebody during a surgery. And Gawande was the guy who pioneered the whole notion of, what we need to do? We need a checklist. The nurses, the scrub nurses, the people on site in the operating room have to have a checklist as to what they brought in and what they took out. And at his hospital, what he found was the teams that used his checklists had a much higher long-term survival rate and lower incident rate than all the other teams. And as you were pointing out earlier, this was all based on past empirical experience. They had that wonder moment where, oh my gosh, we forgot something. And instead, it was down to how many sponges did we put in? How many sponges did we take out? Those kinds of things were being tracked. Gawande came to the realization that this was not just a hospital thing. This was an overall universal risk thing. For the common risks, the things you do every day, you have a checklist. You can have a checklist. Some of you do it mentally. When you get in the car, you look back at the kids, everybody buckled up. Okay, just checking. And that's part of your little mental checklist. We need those checklists and we need them as reminders so we don't forget the boring, mundane, ordinary, everyday, ho-hum kind of risks. There are boring ho-hum kind of risks in IT development. There are boring ho-hum risks, just little things like, oh yeah, we might forget to document some of the code that we wrote. We might forget to document it. Oh, well, we ought to put that on our checklist. Document code before anybody goes home. And amazingly, organizations lose vast wells of corporate knowledge just by virtue of people not documenting what they've done. They assume that everybody else will be able to figure it out. Oh, this was simple. Any chimpanzee could have done this. And the reality is no, it would take somebody a lot brighter than a chimp to actually pull this off. So what we want to be doing is looking from a Gawande kind of perspective at, I want a checklist. Here are the things that we could just overlook, could easily just walk right past, and we're not going to let that happen. We're not going to let that happen.
What, how, I know a lot of our audience and a lot of the people that you work with are technologists and with their project managers within the technology environments and on technology projects. But I mean, risk is universal across all kinds of sectors. How does risk, the principles of risk management differ, or how are they similar, say, between construction and technology, or technology and pharmaceutical development, or various other areas? Is there any particular insight that you have about that, or any axioms that pertain to that?
Well, and you want an axiom: risk is risk. The thing that's hysterical about this is I've been hired by a variety of different organizations. You brought up pharmaceuticals as a good example. I've done plenty of work with big pharma, and working with big pharma, you know, they well, when you come to work with us, we want to focus specifically on pharma risk. That's what we want to nail down. We want to nail down pharma risk. And I'll be like, okay, cool. And in the back of my head, I'm thinking, it's risk. It's still the same thing. It's a matter of first identifying our corporate language for risk. Oh, you can do that in pharma. You can do that in IT. You can do that in construction. Come up with your language for things like high, medium, low. Come up with the lingo that you're going to be using. And then when it comes down to the risks, ask people, ask around the team. Hey, what are you worried about? What do you see as the nightmare? I wept. I had been working for a big telecom for about a dozen years and was very happy with a lot of the things we had come up with and a lot of the things we had developed over the years. And eventually that relationship went by the wayside, as many relationships do, because they were basically often running on their own. Had them on autopilot. I don't have to worry about it anymore. They can handle this. Got a call about 2 years after that relationship ended. And the call was terrifying, because the call was, hey, Carl, guess what? What? You're going to love this. We've decided to create a separate, entirely independent risk office. Yeah, it's going to be centered down in Houston, and all the risks are going to be come up with and run through there. And my heart stopped. And I said, but the team members know what goes wrong. They're the people with the visibility on this. They're the people with the experience on this. And they said, yeah, but we're opening a new risk office. It's going to be so cool. And my head exploded. I couldn't even believe that they were doing this, because if you want to find the best risks, find the people in the trenches. And that doesn't mean old people. That doesn't mean old people. Some of you have hired green people recently. You know who I mean. These young folks fresh out of college, the ones who come in and go, I just graduated from Stanford. Give me power. And it's like, oh, Junior, you have no idea. But you hire these young people. Do you know what? They can see things you can't, because they're fresh faces. And they saw things go on when they were earning their degrees. They saw things go on as they started their internships. They've seen things you haven't seen. One of the most brilliant risk maneuvers I ever saw, one of my research and development clients actually has now made it mandatory for everybody, not just the new hires, but everybody in the company, to go through new hire training at least every other year. And I thought that was just brilliant, because what they're getting is the fresh perspective. They're getting a good look at what's going on today, because yesterday's risks are not necessarily today's risks. We've got a lot of new risks coming down the pike.
Well, I'm glad that you framed it that way, new risks coming down the pike, because I have a final question for you. You know, believe it or not, and you might find this surprising, but most of the smartest engineers that I know, that I talk to about these things, seem to believe that first of all, they would never ever use wire their house up to Internet of Things, for instance, never in a million years. And most of them believe that the biggest risk out there in itself is the internet itself, and are actually in a position now where they are advising clients to literally disconnect from the internet, that you want to move into a world of unconnectedness, because the risks of total connectedness are there's a high probability and B, huge impact. Therefore, they become intolerable, and they must be eliminated somehow. And that the easiest way to do that is simply to disconnect from the internet and to sort of run things locally. What are your thoughts about those types of people? Do you feel that those are legitimate concerns? And what do you think about this push towards deconnecting or disconnecting from the internet?
Well, first off, as you put it there, it sounds a little conspiracy theorist. The internet, Terminator, the internet is coming to get us, kind of thing. I couldn't agree with your engineering friends more.
I so all right.
I do. Yeah, we moved into this house. We just we moved out to the boondocks to become less connected. And I now live in the boondocks in far western Maryland in the mountains. And one of the things that shocked me when I moved into this house was it had the connected heat system. Everything was internet oriented. And within 6 months of when we moved in, we were pulling plugs all over the place. We pretty much live without the internet. When we bought our new fridge, the guy at the hardware store said, "Oh, do you want the internet version or the non-internet version of a refrigerator?" It's like, I think I can live without the internet being built into my fridge. That's okay. And I do think it's a threat. I do. The more things you have connected, the more things will break, either intentionally or unintentionally.
Well, but what do you think about the practicability? If that is that even a word? Is it practicable to to be advising or recommending to businesses that they find ways to kind of unconnect? Is that something that is even practicable given the power of technology these days and the power of being connected? Do you see that as being a viable path forward?
Yeah, if I don't know if you've ever been in a SCIF, a secure compartmented information facility. I think that's what it stands for, but it's a government thing. And the idea is in a SCIF is nothing comes in, nothing goes out. That's the whole plan in a SCIF. And some of the best research going on the planet goes on in SCIFs. So I don't think it's a matter of, oh, we're so isolated, we can't get anything done. I do think we can still get stuff done without being necessarily plugged directly in. But I also think that you're going to have to be connected eventually in one way, shape, or form. But I think it's a function of limiting those connections. And if somebody, not with malice necessarily, like falls prey to a fishing expedition and clicks the wrong link at the wrong time, well, quite frankly, we should be training them. One little quick pointer on that. One of my clients sends out every other month phishing emails to all their personnel, and they make them look good, but they're nothing more than just checking to make sure people don't get phished. And that's fish with a PH. And they send out those. And if you click on one of the links in that email, a little message immediately pops up on your screen and says, "You've been scheduled for remedial phishing training on this date at this time. Do not miss it. It's a job requirement." And it's like, oh, busted. Yeah. So do I think there are ways to remain connected? Yeah. But if you're going to remain connected, you darn well better be insanely vigilant.
Mm-hmm. Good answer. Thank you, Carl. This was a nice discussion. I think we covered a nice amount of territory. It certainly doesn't get to the whole story, but it's a good introduction to why this is important. And I think you framed it nicely. I hope we can have you come back and perhaps explore some of this on a deeper level when you have a chance.
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.